Hello and welcome to this section of the conference, and thank you for tuning in. So for the next sort of half an hour or so, I'm going to try and convince you of why bat parasites are incredibly fascinating, incredibly diverse, and most importantly, why they need our protection and our help. So the title of this talk is Menagerie of a Vampire, the Bizarre Parasites of Bats. And before we get really going, I think it's probably important that I introduce who I am and what I sort of do and why it's worth listening to me about the fascinating world of bat parasites. So my name is Mackenzie Kwak. I'm based at the National University of Singapore in the Department of Biological Science there, and I'm a parasitologist. So most of my research is looking at parasites. So we spend time in the field, we spend time in the lab, we do genomics-y stuff. We do field sampling and in silico analysis. And a lot of that is sort of directed towards three sort of major sort of research areas. One is the impact of anthropogenic changes on parasites. So these are looking at things like changes in climate, changes in land use, the invasion of species, the extinction of species, and how that affects parasite communities, their functioning, their diversity, abundance, and things like that. The next general area we look at is species discovery and systematics. So if we're going to do any of this kind of looking at impacts sort of studies, we need to actually put names to faces. So a lot of our work is also looking, or a lot of my work is also looking at discovering and describing and naming new parasites and trying to work out where they fit into the classification of life on Earth. The third area we look at is ticks and tick-borne diseases, which of course is an increasingly important area as ticks and tick-borne diseases are recognized as greater threats to public health globally. And finally, I spent a bit of time looking at sort of an emerging area, which is parasite conservation biology. And most people sort of say, ugh, why would we want to bother saving parasites? But of course, they have a lot of impacts on our ecosystems as regulators of populations. They also have utility to humans as sources of biopharmaceuticals. So they've spent a long time modulating our immune systems and our nervous systems. So there's all sorts of compounds within them. There's treasure trove of potential pharmaceuticals which could help alleviate mankind's ills. So we need to protect those species so that we don't lose any of those useful ecosystem services or the useful services they might have for human health. But let's jump into bats, shall we? Before we start to think about bat parasites, we need to actually think about bats and where they came from. So this lush ecosystem here is a landscape during the Miocene. So this is just after the dinosaurs went extinct, or this is some millions of years after the dinosaurs went extinct. During the Miocene, the Earth is essentially a greenhouse environment. So there's very, very little snow or ice at the poles. The temperature is relatively or significantly more uniform across the latitudes compared with today, for instance. And so the Earth is this big, wet, warm forest. Of course, that's not everything, but I mean, a lot of it is a big, wet, warm forest. And during this period, this is when we find the first bat fossils, the first fossils of what we consider sort of modern bats. And in this illustration here, you can actually see in the top left-hand corner, you can see a number of small bats perched up there in the tree. So this is the kind of ecosystem that bats are first starting to sort of massively diversify within. And of course, as the bats are diversifying, the parasites are diversifying with them. So where did bats come from exactly? So bats seem to, or the paleontological evidence seems to suggest that bats originate from some sort of arboreal mammal ancestor that seems to have developed some proclivity for gliding, and that gradually over evolutionary time, they've become more and more competent over generations. They've become more and more competent at it to the point where we go from this sort of small arboreal mammal into these small flying arboreal mammals, which are our modern bats. Of course, gliding and the sort of transitional forms that we see, this sort of gliding habit is not not terribly rare in the mammal family tree. So it's actually evolved. We certainly have representatives that engage in this gliding and have convergently evolved this similar form of getting around the treetops and the canopy 3 independent times, at least. So one species we have here in Southeast Asia, where I'm based, are the colugos, which are their own very, very unique lineage of mammals. And that's the top illustration you can see there. Then where I'm from originally, Australia, we have another group of these gliding mammals, which we call them sugar gliders. They also have other members in the group like greater gliders, yellow-bellied gliders. Some people call them gliding phalangers, so gliding possums. And so they're actually marsupials. And then the final group of modern flying mammals we have are squirrels, which are, of course, rodents. And there are many different species of flying squirrels. It's clearly been a very, very successful adaptation. But you can kind of see these species they're not the ancestors of bats. They're not necessarily very closely related to bats, but they're employing a similar method of getting around to what has been hypothesized as the ancestors of bats may have been doing before they transitioned to true flight, powered flight, versus what these species are doing, which is essentially gliding. So it's not true flight. So why exactly are bats such excellent hosts for such a shocking diversity of parasites? When I say shocking, I mean shockingly good diversity of parasites. So one reason why they're so good is that they have very highly social communities, very highly social populations. So bats will spend a lot of time roosting together, talking to each other, grooming each other in some cases. So because they're spending so much time in close proximity, parasites have a chance to move around on different individuals and for the populations to get large because they have this big food source. And particularly for ectoparasites, having a lot of individuals in close contact is very good. And anybody who's ever had children at school when there's a louse outbreak or an outbreak of lice will know how quickly ectoparasites like lice can spread amongst children, which are very highly social and touching each other and in very close contact. And it's the same with bats. So bats are spending a lot of time in close contact. And so, of course, it's a very good system for parasites to be diversifying and living in because they've got all these available hosts. And you can see in this image of this particular slide, you can see one small bat fly climbing on the face of one of the bats in this image. Well, I mean, it's small by bat fly standards, but it's quite large compared with that bat there. Another driver of the great diversity of parasites within bats is the fact that many species engage in multi-species roosting. So in many mammal species, you'll typically have one species within a den or a dray or a burrow or a warren or whatever sort of space the mammal is resting and sheltering in. In the case of bats, often you'll have multiple species within one cave or one hollow or within the, say, attic or roof of a house. And so when you have multiple species roosting together, the chances that parasites can jump from one species to another and then potentially diversify from their other members of the species is reasonably good. So you're bringing these species together and then you're splitting them apart as these host species are coming together and moving apart during their roosting behavior. And so over millions of years, that's a great way to sort of drive speciation. And so you get many, many species of parasites on bats because they have such close contact with other bat species. And so it's a good opportunity for these parasites to jump off and diversify. Another factor which drives the high diversity of parasites on bats is the high roost fertility of bats. So bats are typically wed to their roosting area surprisingly well. And many of them will return, in some cases over generations, to a single cave where the entire population will live in some places. And you'll have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bats in some cases, all using this same cave for generations and generations. Of course, some bats will move around throughout the year, certainly in southern Australia. We know that the bats will use different hollows depending on the season so they can more carefully regulate their body temperatures during their torpor period. So torpor is somewhat like hibernation. So when they drop their body temperature down, they want to be somewhere that's nice and cool during that winter rest period when food is very low. So they will move a little bit, but many bats will come and revisit the same cave or hollow nesting area over and over again. So if you're a parasite, you can synchronize and expect your bat to return, because the greatest tragedy for a parasite is to lose your host, because that's your home and your dinner. And so, of course, if you're abandoned and your bat never comes back, you starve to death, and your whatever community there, your community of parasites vanishes. Whereas if your bats are coming back every night or every few months, then you've got a chance to feed and move around the ecosystem. So the fact that there's a high roost fidelity in many bat species is quite an important factor for parasite diversity. Another factor is high dispersal ability. So bats can move over very broad areas, which means that you can transport parasites with them across very broad areas. So for instance, if one bat species or one area is wiped out by a bushfire or a flood or a hurricane, and all the suitable nesting habitat is gone, potentially your bats can disperse to quite sort of broad areas far away from this event to protect themselves. And also, if they're already moving quite far away or able to move quite far away to start with, you have these kind of insurance populations. So you can have reasonably widespread species in some cases, which in some other small mammal species, some small mammals and some marsupials, they're very small, that don't disperse as well. Typically that can lead to declines in extinctions. So it's good for bats and it's good for their parasites that they can disperse quite far. And when I say like quite far, I mean reasonably far. So for instance, the grey-headed flying fox, which is a species we find around my hometown of Melbourne, can disperse up to 50 kilometres in a single night's feeding. So it's quite an extensive ability to sort of move around the ecosystem, move around the landscape. And so here's an example of some bats flying above Melbourne City as the sun's setting. And there's great clouds of them moving through the landscape. Sheltered roosts is also a very, very important thing for bats. Bats and their parasites are incredibly vulnerable to things like desiccation. They don't want to be drying out, and they're also very vulnerable to predation. As you can see, this is an unfortunate bat fly, probably of the genus Cyclopodia, and it looks like it's probably fallen off what I would guess is a flying fox, and it's landed far away, and unfortunately, a group of green tree ants has discovered it, and now they're dismembering it. So bats and their parasites want to be very far away from predators, and they want to be in relatively sort of thermally stable environments. They want somewhere nice, dark, cool, not too cold, not too hot kind of thing. And so the fact that they have these they tend to pick very, very sheltered and protected environments means that these populations of bat parasites can build up to remarkable numbers because they have very low, in some cases, predator pressure. Finally, bats are endothermic. So it means that they are, endothermic is sort of another word that we sometimes use for warm-blooded. So endothermic, it means they control their body temperature. And so because bats can control their body temperature, their parasites have something of an advantage over other parasites which may have chosen to live on so-called poikilothermic or cold-blooded animals, which don't regulate their own body temperature. So parasites are all invertebrates, and so they can't control their body temperature. So they're reliant on some other factor for maintaining their body temperature and therefore keeping their metabolism nice and high in some cases. So if you're on a reptile, reptiles can go out into the sun during the day and they can warm up a little bit, and they can get quite warm. They can get warmer than mammals in some cases. But then, of course, at night, they go and shelter somewhere and their body temperature drops down to the ambient temperature. Whereas bats have a very stable body temperature, often in the high 30s to low 40s. So if you have a look at this graph here, this is essentially development day rate, just a general insect development day rate. And so you can see as the temperature goes up, it reaches this sweet spot somewhere between sort of 35 and maybe 42 degrees Celsius, at which point insects can develop very rapidly. And so if you want to have many offspring and you want to have lots of generations and lots of descendants, having a high metabolism so that you can produce lots of young quickly is a very good move. And also, because you're using this bat, you're not dependent on the outside environment. You don't have to, say, slow down necessarily during the wintertime when the temperature is cold, and the reptile parasites have to slow their development somewhat because the reptiles go into hibernation or brumination. So let's have a look at some of the bat parasites. So certainly there are lots of different, at least bat ectoparasites, which have evolved. Within the family tree of insects, this is just the insects, so we're ignoring all the other arthropods, of which there are many. This is just the insects, and we can see that broadly for bats, at least 3 different major groups of insects have independently evolved to parasitize bats. So on the top we have the order Hemiptera, which are the true bugs. So these are relatives of aphids and cicadas. And up there we have, from left to right, we have hissing bugs. The next one along is a polyctenid. This is a very, very rare bug family, which is only found on bats. There's somewhere between 20 to 30 species, and they're very, very incredibly rare. During the broad period that I've been working on bat parasites, I've seen maybe 5 individuals of them. And this is from having looked at the parasites of literally thousands and thousands of bats. They're incredibly rare. The final one are the bat bugs, and these are relatives of our bed bugs. The next one down we have is the order Siphonaptera. So these are the fleas, which we will probably know and loathe from the individuals which jump around on our dogs or cats. But of course, at least one family of fleas has evolved specifically on bats, and they can only be found on bats now. The final group are the Diptera. So these are the true flies. So these are things like fruit flies and blowflies and bot flies. And a number of groups of flies have evolved to become highly specialized ectoparasites of bats. So let's meet some of them. So these first 2 individuals on the top left are the bat flies. And the next one along, we have a polyctenid, we have a bat bug, we have a kissing bug, we have this wonderful bat flea. And then the bottom 3 are arachnids. So these are obviously the arachnids are the group that incorporates spiders and scorpions, mites, harvestmen, pseudoscorpions, europygids, tailless whip scorpions. So it's quite a diverse group, very, very species rich, particularly for the spiders. Probably something that blows the spiders out of the water, though, as far as diversity, though, are the mites. The mites are mega, mega diverse. We know very little about the mites, and the majority of Earth's mites have not been named yet. And even we're finding many, many, many new mites and ticks on bat species still after many, many, many decades of work. So starting from the left to the right, this very hairy four-legged mite is a bat wing mite, and this only lives on the membrane of the wings of bats. It can be found nowhere else, and this whole family is only found there. The next one along, this round creature, is a soft tick, and it has this sort of round body, and on the underside is its mouth parts where it feeds from. And the final individual we have is a hard tick, and so this long-legged member of the genus Isodes is a specialist of generally microbats. So let's have a look at some of these families, and I'll try and convince you of why I think they're certainly some of the most interesting organisms on Earth, and certainly some of the most interesting parasites on Earth. So the first is this absolutely bizarre family called the Nycteribiidae. The Nycteribiidae are sometimes called bat flies. And on the left, you can see a close relative of this family, which is the tsetse fly, the absolute scourge of Africa. And this is probably somewhat like the ancestor of the bat flies would have been like. This free-flying hematophagous, so blood-feeding parasitic fly. Within Africa, the tsetse flies will fly around, they'll feed on people, and they'll cause sleeping sickness in humans as they spread a small parasite called a trypanosome. Within cattle, they call a disease called Nagana, which is a very similar, also trypanosomal disease of livestock. And this is probably what the ancestor of these bat flies would have looked like. But of course, if you're hanging around on bats, it doesn't necessarily pay to fly around because the bats all roost very tightly together. So you don't necessarily always need wings to be moving between hosts. And so in the case of the nycteribids, they've actually completely lost their wings. They never grow wings. The wings are completely absent. And so they've evolved into this much more strong, very robust-legged, sort of spider-like parasites which scurry through the fur of the bats. So they've basically gone from flies to hawks. Of course, not all of them have gone from flies to hawks. There's a sister family called the Streblidae, and these are the flying bat flies. And they have retained their wings. They're not very powerful flyers, but they can sort of engage in brief periods of flight between host species. So although wings seem to have been selected against through the evolution of flies as ectoparasites, some of them still retain their wings. Whether it's a trait that's going to, say, vanish in 50 million years or not remains to be seen. But clearly there's still some utility for it. Of course, this group is very unique because it also has another special group within it, the Ascodipteran, which is a special genus within this winged bat fly family. And the females in this case have lost their legs and they've lost their wings. So you can see it in the photo on the right-hand side here. This blob, this maggot-like organism, is actually the adult female of this genus. And she's completely lost her wings and legs in favor of becoming a subdermal parasite of bats, which is absolutely fascinating. So this one family has evolved all sorts of different traits to live on bats. Some have decided we'll keep, evolutionists have decided for them, we'll keep our wings. Others have got to a point where wings are very cumbersome, and of course, growing them is very expensive. You have to expend resources, which you could use to grow other things. So that's very difficult. And wings can get damaged, wings can get caught on things. So for them, it's certainly not advantageous. They've decided, no, we'll get rid of the wings, no wings for us. And there's, of course, this final group within these bat flies where they've gone perhaps overboard, and the females have basically said, no, we're not going to grow wings or legs. We'll basically just be little egg machines or little sort of egg reproductive machines, and we'll just be these sort of blobs. And so in this case, the females are these blobs that live under the skin, and the males still grow wings and they move between bats. They fly between bats, finding these little sort of Jabba the Hutt blob females to reproduce with. Another fascinating aspect of the bat flies is that I would consider them some of the greatest mothers of the living world, I think, of the natural world. So on the left-hand side, you can see the typical life cycle of a fly. And on the right-hand side, you can see the typical life cycle of a bat fly. On the left, the very typical life cycle of a fly is that a fly will mate, and then it'll produce, in many cases, thousands of eggs. And so if it's a blowfly, it'll lay them on some carrion or some animal dung. Fruit flies will lay them in fruit, often fallen fruit. The larvae will then typically go through 3 larval stages. And then they'll finally form a cocoon, a pupa, before an adult emerges. Of course, if you're doing this, though, you're a very vulnerable individual because anything could come along. You're a grub. In many cases, they don't have very good visual capabilities. So all sorts of things come along and eat you. And so because of that, your typical female fly is like, I'll make thousands of young, and if 2 of them survive or 1 of them survive, I'm happy because I've reproduced myself, kind of thing. Because the expectation is that most of the eggs, offspring, or pupae, if they make it that far, will be killed. They'll be predated on, or they'll be parasitized by some other organism, often parasitic wasps and smaller parasitic flies. So they go for, let's produce lots and hope that something gets through. The bat flies, on the other hand, have gone in completely the opposite direction. The female will only have 1 offspring at a time, which is very, very rare in invertebrates. Essentially, she will produce an egg, the egg will hatch, and she'll keep it inside her in a pouch, and she'll feed it on a special insect milk. So in many cases, they're a little bit like the marsupials of the insect world, these little pouches inside them and this milk which they feed their offspring. And this is a process technically called or defined as adenotrophic vivipary, which is a great boggle word if you're ever struggling in that game. I don't know if it's a valid word, but there you go. Essentially what happens is they feed these offspring within them, the maggot, a single maggot at a time. The female's abdomen swells up to gigantic proportions as this offspring grows. And then when the offspring is ready to form a pupa, a cocoon, the female ejects the young maggot, and the maggot immediately congeals itself to the wall of the roost site and forms this hardened cocoon. After a few weeks, the bat fly then emerges and crawls onto the nearest bat host. So in this case, they've decided, no, we're not going to sacrifice any of our young. We're going to do a very, very good job of raising these young very successfully. And so that's what they do. Interestingly enough, though, bat flies are also hosts themselves. So the bats host the bat flies, and then the bat flies host these bizarre organisms. These are small parasitic fungi. The fungi that we know and love and eat in many cases produce these great networks of hyphae. These are pale root-like structures which will often grow through rotting wood, leaf litter, they'll grow through the soil. And then the part of the fungi we actually see is the mushroom. This fungi, on the other hand, does not grow this extensive network of hyphae, this mycelium. Instead, the entire body of this fungus is this strange elongated structure which grows on the cuticle. So it grows on essentially the skin, the outer shell, the armor of the bat fly. So our bats are supporting this great diversity of very interesting bat flies, and then our bat flies are supporting this fantastic diversity of these interesting fungi. So there's all these kind of layers to this parasitic interactions, which is absolutely fascinating. Interestingly enough, though, although the Streblidae, the winged bat flies, and the Nycteribidae, the wingless bat flies, seem to share a common ancestor that they also share with the tsetse fly, but it's some sort of tsetse fly-like blood-feeding but free-flying parasite, there is another group of flies which evolved completely on their own to converge on this form of a bat fly. So clearly life on bats as an ectoparasitic diptera, an ectoparasitic fly, is a very useful one because it's evolved independently more than once. So this special little family of bat flies has only a single member, and it probably arose when when bats arrived in New Zealand. So the bats that arrived there had probably no parasites or no bat fly parasites on them. So this little native New Zealand fly, its ancestors seem to have evolved on the bats, and they've gradually evolved this form which is very, very similar to the other bat flies. So they've lost their wings completely. They develop these very strong, robust legs, and they essentially feed on the blood of the bats there. And it's probably because New Zealand is very isolated and hasn't necessarily been connected with much of the world for a very, very long time. So this is the species that it's found on. It's on the New Zealand lesser short-tailed bat, which is presently categorized as threatened. So it's listed as vulnerable by the IUCN. So unfortunately, if we lose this precious little bat, which is one of only 2 remaining native mammal species on all of New Zealand. New Zealand is basically a country of birds and a few sort of token reptiles. But they do have these 2 bats. And if this particular species is lost, we'll lose our very, very evolutionarily peculiar New Zealand bat fly. So that's something to potentially be aware of, that when we're losing these species, we're not just losing the host species, we're losing all the parasites that are associated with it. And who knows what sort of interesting parasitic fungi are living on this New Zealand bat fly. So very interesting stuff. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how the flea lost its jump. The fleas that we know and, as I said, loathe are typically the fleas that we find on our pets, but occasionally jump onto us. So these are known for their ability to jump. They're always jumping off cats and dogs as the cats and dogs are grooming themselves, and they're jumping onto us and biting us. When you're a flea on a bat at the top of a high cave, though, or in a big roosting chamber, jumping around isn't necessarily a very advantageous thing to do, because it's very easy to lose your host and end up on the bottom of a cave. So the typical flea jump was actually studied and first characterized by a great hero of mine, the late Dame Miriam Rothschild, who worked on fleas for a huge proportion of her life, decades and decades and decades. And she was the first to work out how they actually did it. Fleas don't actually jump from their feet. They jump, in some sense, from their knees, from their joints. Fleas have a very special, very, very elastic protein called resilin, which is present at the base. It's present in a few of the joints, but the greatest concentration of it in most fleas is found in what's called the pleural arch. So this is this structure just underneath the pleural plate, which is what the arrow in this slide is pointing to. And essentially you can see this image, these images, this set of 4 images were taken from her original paper of when it was first published decades and decades ago. And so essentially the flea gets down onto this, somewhere flat or some sort of base, and then it sort of curls itself up. And what it's doing there is it's pulling its legs together and it's storing energy in this resilin, it's preparing. And then finally when it releases it, all this energy from the resilin comes out and it springs this flea a great distance. And so if you're a flea on a cat or a dog, you're already on the ground. Moving yourself around the den isn't such a risky proposition, because chances are there are other pups or other kittens in this den. And so flicking yourself around, you're not going to land necessarily very far from your host. And chances are you'll be able to find another host, which is what every parasite wants, is to have a nice warm blood meal, or what every flea wants anyway. However, if you're living in a cave and you drop 15 meters to the bottom of the cave, you may never find a bat again and you may starve. And so it seems that through evolutionary history, the ability to jump in bat fleas has been completely lost. They basically lack these pleural arches, this structure filled with resilin, which is needed to jump. So the bat flea has lost its jump, probably to avoid losing its beloved host. Interestingly enough, though, of course, bat fleas do still sometimes, like many ectoparasites, become separated from their meal ticket. So recently, this was a fascinating behavior was observed in Southeast Asia, in my region. And it was that when the bat fleas sometimes end up on the bottom of the cave, they'll actually wait for a passing cave earwig, and they'll lock themselves on to the leg, and they'll basically use the earwig as a taxi service. Earwigs are constantly moving around the cave, in many cases eating bat droppings, but all sorts of other things. They're scavenging. And so as they're moving around, they're potentially climbing up. And so when the flea hops on, it rides around this earwig cave taxi until it gets close enough to a bat, at which point it clambers off and walks along until it returns and is reunited to a bat host. So they have all sorts of interesting ways of getting around. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about another potential enemy of ours, the bedbug, and where it came from. So when humans first sort of left Africa, as we immigrated into the rest of the world and spread our species across the land, we encountered quite cold latitudes. So trying to move into, say, Northeast Asia or Europe or North America is a very difficult endeavor because it's very snowy and cold for half of the year. And so humans started to inhabit these caves as they moved into northern latitudes. And as we did that, we started to come into contact with 2 very important parasites which have been with us ever since. These are the tropical bedbug, Chimax hemipterus, and the temperate bedbug, Chimax lectiolaris. Most of us are a lot more common with the temperate cave bug, the temperate bedbug, Chimex lectularis. Although people that live in the tropics, certainly in Singapore here, we have predominantly Chimex hemipterus. And originally the hypothesis was that these two apparently closely related bed bugs of the same genus, the suggestion was that potentially one of them had evolved with our relative Homo erectus, one of the earlier member of our genus that had left Africa before we did and spread out all across the Eurasian continent and even into Southeast Asia to some extent. And that as they first got into caves, one lineage of bat bugs had specialized to live on them, potentially. And that the second invasion, as humans displaced Homo erectus, we inherited their bat bug. And we also got our own as a new lineage, a fresh lineage evolved onto us. However, a recent study which dated the divergence between these two species found that actually these species have more than 30 million years of divergence between them. So they last shared a common ancestor more than 30 million years ago, which really debunks that whole hypothesis because Homo erectus and Homo and humans certainly weren't around 30 million years ago. So they did their study and they actually found that probably these two bugs have independently colonized humans and have independently evolved, not on us, but potentially they've suggested Chimex hemipterus may have evolved on birds potentially dwelling in caves, although Chimex hemipterus is also found on bats, and that Chimex lectularis has also diverged on bats before we've inherited them. Interestingly enough, though, despite the fact that the majority of members of this group, these so-called bat bugs, do live on bats, they actually predate bats by a very long time. So dating of this group suggests that the so-called bat bugs probably evolved during the late Cretaceous era. So this is when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth, a little bit over 100 million years ago. And so they evolved during the Cretaceous period on who knows what, potentially dinosaurs. They certainly feed on birds. So that's an option, maybe on mammals. And then eventually, clearly all their ancestors that were on these sort of other things in many cases have disappeared. And so now the modern bat bugs are mostly living on predominantly bats, but also on birds and on some terrestrial mammals. So bat bugs or our bed bugs, we've inherited from bats living in caves, and they've inherited them from who knows what, because they predate bats by quite a long time. The oldest bats are probably evolving somewhere around 70 million years ago, and then they appear in the fossil record about 50 million years ago. But these chaps here are predating them by at least 30 million years, probably a bit more. Interestingly enough, there does seem to be some difference in distribution between the two species of bat bugs which have evolved to exploit us humans. And as the common name suggests, the temperate and the tropical bed bugs seem to have been partitioned themselves along some kind of latitudinal gradient. So the green dots here are where we find many of the tropical bed bugs. And then the red dots, or the red regions, are where we find predominantly temperate bed bugs. Interestingly enough, though, laboratory studies suggest that these species have quite a lot of thermal tolerance. So the temperate bed bug can survive in the tropical zone, and the tropical bed bug can survive in the temperate zone. So the question then is, how are these bed bugs partitioned in this way, and what's keeping those barriers from breaking down? To some extent, the barriers seem to be breaking down. So now we find that certainly in most metropolises, we find the temperate bed bug, Chimex lectularis, seems to be invading many of these environments. And we're also finding some cases of Chimex hemipterus invading some of the temperate zones as well. So the tropical bed bug is getting into the temperate zones, and the temperate bed bug seems to be moving into the tropical zones. So how have they been partitioning for so long? And the answer is probably very violent sex, which is quite a peculiar way to partition yourself. So bed bugs are the insect masters of BDSM. They engage in all sorts of nasty, traumatic things, particularly traumatic insemination. And in this case, the male bedbug, when he finds a female, will not actually wait to go into her genital opening. He'll just stab her. So he'll stab her with his phallus, his penis, and he'll just inject sperm directly into her. Within their species, this typically is not a problem. So the female's body will then gather up the sperm and store it in spermathecae, and then use it to produce eggs later. However, when different species of bedbugs artificially inseminate one another, typically the female will die. So in many cases, so in this case, it is quite possible that when Chimex lectularis, the temperate bedbugs, makes it into the tropical zone and tries to mate with the local females there, that they all just die. And so this barrier is keeping these species from moving in too much, which is quite a possibility. But of course, it's something that we need more study on, but it's quite fascinating, I think. Finally, let's consider what the future of bats and their parasites are, because we live in a period of immense global change. So these are two interesting maps or graphs which I think are useful for illustrating a point. The first is on the left here, and this is basically an idea of that they surveyed a range of different bat biologists, and they said, what, in your opinion, as a professional bat biologist, do you think are the greatest drivers of bat decline globally? And so you can see them stacked there. So the majority of just over the majority of bat biologists believe that deforestation was probably the most significant driver. Many also said that climate change, intensive agriculture, urbanization, infectious diseases like white nose syndrome, which is caused by a parasitic fungus, which kills hibernating bats in North America, that's a real risk. And then finally, hunting, because in some regions, places like India, they still do bat hunts. In Papua New Guinea, they still do some bat harvesting. And basically places where people are eating bats, that's also quite a risk to global bat populations. The second graph is depicting where we have the highest versus the lowest bat richness. So if you're in northern Siberia, there are basically no bats. There's almost no bat diversity. As we get closer to the tropics, though, the equatorial zone, we find that the bat diversity goes up significantly. And among the tropical regions, Southeast Asia, Central Africa, but of course, northern South America, tropical South America, Brazil, Venezuela, these areas have hyper bat diversity, massive bat diversity. So we have a whole bunch of these factors which are affecting bats. Bats tend to be concentrated in the tropics. Unfortunately, the tropics is also a zone where we have immense poverty compared with what we might call the global north. So the developed nations. In tropical regions, nations are disproportionately developing still. So that doesn't bear well because many of these factors we have are associated with development. So things like deforestation, things like urbanization, things like hunting are often associated with lower socioeconomic economies. But where do bats compare in terms of their conservation? Because of course, if we understand the conservation of bats, we can have some understanding of the conservation of their parasites. So if we have a look at this graph on the far left-hand side, we can see that quite a number of bats are threatened. So we can see there are plenty, there are some that are critically endangered, some that are vulnerable, some that are near threatened, which is a decent chunk of them. The majority of bats are listed as least concern. But interestingly enough, compared with, say, other mammals or birds, there's a lot of data deficient bats. So these are species for which we have such little ecological or population trend data, we actually can't do any kind of estimation of what's happening to their populations. So potentially these are species which may be vanishing from our forests and our world without us even knowing, because potentially they're in difficult to survey places, or maybe they're rare species, or maybe they're difficult to sample. Finally, the two graphs or the two maps on the right-hand side are the proportion of threatened species and the proportion of data deficient species. So we can see the majority of threatened species are actually in my region of Southeast Asia. And so in places like the sort of Indo-Chinese, the continental Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. And also in the West Pacific. So you can see there's it's lighting up in places like the Solomon Islands and Fiji, where there's quite a number of threatened bat species. You can also see some in Africa, and there's a good chunk in South America. What's more worrying, though, is when you have a look at the second map down the bottom, this data deficient species, we find that the species that are especially data deficient are in the global south. So these are species in predominantly developing countries, and the real hotspot for it is in tropical South America. So this is the place with our highest richness of bats, also has our highest number, unsurprisingly, of data deficient bats. So this is an indication that we need to get out there. We need to sample bats. We need to sample their parasites. We need to understand what the population trends are looking like if we're going to have any hope of protecting them. So really, any bat researchers, anybody interested in bats, needs to start looking to the tropics, if they're not already, if they want to do some really meaningful bat conservation, or likewise, parasitologists, if they want to be doing some meaningful bat parasite conservation, we need to really seriously be looking at tropics, because that's where the majority of our data deficient or threatened bats are. That's where the majority of our bats in general are. And that's where a lot of our species are going to be going extinct, especially as many of these countries move from developing countries to developed countries over the next 50 to say 100 years. So finally, I'd like to make some acknowledgements. So first, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the institutions and individuals that allowed me to use the images of some bat parasites. And then, of course, I'd like to thank the organizers who actually invited me here to talk your ear off about bat parasites. Li Chunhua, who has organized the parasite section of this conference with great skill. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for listening and considering bats and their parasites as something worthy of your attention.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Kwak, for the amazing presentation, and thank you for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
So we will now take questions. The very first question we have is from Sandra Avila, asked, after mating and with the ovule still in the female, they make the pupa? So this question is in reference of the parasitic flies that are ovoviviparous.
Sure. Okay, so this is the Hippoboscoidea. So these are the bat flies, right? So essentially, it doesn't form a pupa while it's in the female. The female will nourish the young, adenotrophic vivipary is what it's called, and then she will oviposit the larva. So the larva will spend a very, very brief few minutes as an immature, free-living individual. And basically it spends this whole time sitting there trying not to get eaten or groomed or anything like that off the host. And then the pupa will start to form around the larva itself. And then it will sort of form this pupa, which will glue onto the side of the roost, the cave, the hollow, whatever it's in. And then it'll develop within that pupa, yeah.
Thank you. And our next question is from Diane Barton. How does the actual parasite diversity, species richness, and intensity of infection of microbats, fruit bats, compare to microbats?
Hard question. So the truth is, it's not, I would say, not well studied enough to be able to make the comparison. Exactly. So obviously we know that the microbats are far more species rich than the megabats, that the Microchiroptera is very, very rich. The Megachiroptera is reasonably species poor, I would say. And it's typically more of an equatorial group, whereas the microbats are found across the board from very, very high temperate latitudes through to the tropics. If we were just going on a species, like a total diversity aspect, of course, the microbats win out because they just have more species. So of course you have many more ectoparasites on them. In terms of a, say, species for species kind of approach of what's the mean number of parasites on a megabat versus the mean number of parasites, say species diversity on a microbat, it probably comes out relatively similar. Even in species that aren't roosting in, what would you say, sheltered environments like caves or hollows, so the large fruit bats, they still manage to have a reasonably high diversity of even things like bat flies. So the bat flies in those cases will be laying their pupae, sometimes on the underside of branches, under bark, things like that. So they still manage to have reasonably similar parasite diversity on them. And when we look at them, a lot of the species which are sort of bat specialists tend to undertake this adenotrophic vivipary. So this like massive investment in single offspring at a time. So not only the bat flies do it, but the spintonicid wing mites, which spend their entire existence on the wings of bats, also have convergently evolved towards this single, this same reproductive system of producing one offspring at a time, putting a huge amount of energy into it. So I would say to run a complicated, say, good quantitative analysis looking at, say, mean diversity per species, comparing microbats to macrobats, I don't necessarily think we have enough available data. I mean, we could run it, but there's probably a lot of species that are undescribed, especially among the mites on bats. Certainly for abundance, man, your guess is as good as mine. It's the data is certainly not there to be able to do some kind of big meta-analysis of it. But I would say on average, they probably have reasonably similar diversity. You might see slightly higher diversity on the microbats simply because they roost in more protected environments. So it gives you chances to have extra groups of ectoparasites, which basically don't occur on megabats. Things like the Ichnosylidae, which are the bat fleas. They basically, the larvae they eat blood flecks from the adults, and they'll sometimes eat detritus. So they need somewhere stable and safe to grow up. And obviously, if you're a fruit bat colony living in a fig tree, the chances of that flea getting back up to find a fruit bat is very, very low. So that family of fleas is basically non-existent almost on any of the Megachiroptera, almost. So probably the Microchiroptera win out by a hair, sort of thing. That would be my general sense for it. Still very diverse in both groups.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mickey. Considering the large size of the ectoparasites and the diversity, is there evidence of interspecific competition modulating parasite species richness?
Yeah, good, very good question. And the answer is, for most species, we have absolutely no idea. Certainly, associates of mine who collect, so say bat carers that I'm close with, who collect specimens for me, say that they do tend to find some partitioning on the host. And we find evidence, certainly in other ectoparasite groups and other host groups, for some sort of niche partitioning, or like partitioning of feeding habitats. So we know, for instance, ticks on birds, in some groups anyway, the ticks will disproportionately aim for the head because it's very, very hard to groom the head. So clearly evolution has favored this sort of strategy because all the individuals that stuck around in other parts of the body of the birds got groomed off. So some species of bird ticks will specifically aim for the head. We certainly know that in things like sea snake ticks, Amblyomynitidum, they typically go for damage around the body. So they'll go for, if a snake has had scarring or something during a shed or from predation or something, they'll often try and find these tight little crevices, or they'll go around the cloaca or the ear openings and things like that. So in bats, there is certainly observational, like personal observations of this happening. I wouldn't say that within, say, the literature on bats that it's been particularly well studied. And even in some other more well-studied groups, like say birds or reptiles, there's not a huge amount of data on it yet. It's certainly coming, and it's coming sort of hot and fast for some of these groups. But for bats, it hasn't been very well studied yet, but it probably is
occurring to some extent. Certainly for some groups on bats, we know that there definitely is partitioning of space, that some groups will favor very particular zones. So we know, say, the spintonissid mites, the bat wing mites, spend their entire life on the bat wing membrane. You never find them almost ever on the fur of the bat. They're almost always on the wing membrane. So there's clearly some levels of partitioning going on for this entire family of mites has decided amongst itself. They've got together and they've said the wings are really good. You're not going to get groomed off there very easily. And there's lots of available blood vessels to feed on. Drink up, boys. But for some other groups like bat flies, it's less clear. And the fact that when we collect them, so when you're handling bats, man, they go everywhere. Like they're scurrying through fur. So trying to work out where they most like to occur is a really, really tough question. For things that are more sedentary when they feed, like ticks, it's a lot easier. But for these actively moving things like bat fleas and bat flies, good luck to whatever grad student wants to try and work that out. It's kind of a thankless job and it'll be very, very hard. But there probably is some level of partitioning going on, I would guess.
Thank you. In the interest of time, this is the end of this session. Thank you again for Dr. Mackenzie Kwak for the great presentation and answering our questions.
Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. And our next session, we will have parasite and host animals with pouches from Dr. Michelle Power and Dr. Stephanie Godfrey.